Hi, this is Bill Gutchis, and this is another session of Technically Retired. We're going to talk today about building pivot tables using Excel. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my spreadsheet, which should be right there. We share that. All right, so you should now be able to see the spreadsheet that I'm going to use for this pivot table exercise. I've extracted several months worth of data from my checking account, and I made some changes. I took the payee column and took all of the account information out so that nobody could use this data to hack into my checking account. I created a category column so that I could generally describe what the category of payment or deposit or payment for this transaction is. And I've also created a short payee so that I could list things. For example, everything related to the forward payment will go under the forward payee. Everything that was related to one of my Verizon accounts will be Verizon 1 or Verizon 3, blah, 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 stuff like that. So that I've created these columns: short payee, category, and I've reduced some of the incriminating evidence from the original payee that came from the checking account. So I've downloaded 6 months worth. There are 458 rows of data in here in this tab called checks. You'll notice at the bottom that the tab has been named checks. And in order to start a pivot table, we need to select, what I do is select all the headers and do a Control-Shift down to highlight all of the data that's in the spreadsheet. So now I'm telling the pivot table, once I select pivot table, is that I want you to use all this data that I've highlighted as candidate data to be manipulated by the pivot table. So now, how do we go about inserting a pivot table? Well, insert's kind of a keyword. You go to the insert menu, and on the top left here, into the table section, you'll see pivot table. There is also recommended pivot table, which we're not going to go into. We're just going to do a simple pivot table to start. So we click on the pivot table option, and this little dialog box pops up that says, this is the table range of data that you've given me, checks from column A1 to G458. And if you look at the highlighted stuff, it's A1 to G458. It also gives you an option about where to place the pivot table. You can place it in this tab or worksheet. I typically choose not to. I put it in a separate or new worksheet, and then you just hit OK, and it creates the setup for a separate tab where we can build the pivot table. There's a little informational piece that comes up here that says, in order to build a report, you choose the fields, blah, blah, blah. I read all that stuff. But I'm also going to change the tab name down here. Just double click on it so that I can call it pivot 001. All right. So now the tab name is pivot 001. The checks data is still here in the checks tab. And now if we click into this pivot table, this comment area, then we get the data, this column on the right that shows that it says pivot table fields. These are all the data columns that have been selected from the checks tab and are available to be manipulated in the pivot table. One of the first things I just want to show you is that if you take the short payee field, remember I manipulated this so that it was a brief name of the payee, and you drag it into the rows column, then it will create a row for each one of the payees, right? So it's alphabetically sorted from 5 guys, which numeric is usually first, to whatever the last entry is in the alphabet, goes to Z. This one just goes to Wish. So Wish is another payee. So I have another row that is ready to take every piece of data related to Wish or WinZip or any one of these payees, all the way up to and including 5 guys. So it's alphabetic. It's a single row for each payee, and it's ready for data. Typically, what kind of data would you like to see when you're analyzing a checkbook? Well, I'd like to see how much I spent. So we can take the amount field and put this into the values section of the pivot table, and it will show the total amount of value for all checks in each row whether it's Act Blue for donations, oh, that shows my political alignment, whether it's Aqua for the water bill or anything else, right? And it's also important to notice down here that in values, you have several choices for the kind of field settings you want. You can make this field a sum or a count of incidences, an average, a minimum, or product, any one of a number of things. For a checkbook, it makes sense to have the sum of the total amount of checks written to each one of the payees. So that's what we're going to leave it as. All right. If you remember in the setup, I talked about the fact that I created a category field for each one of these payees. So I'm going to take the category field and just take a look at what each of the categories are for each of these payees. For example, Five Guys is food, ARP is medical, Amazon and AMZ. I don't know why there's two different payees for that, but they should both be Amazon, I think. But one of them is for marketing and shopping. The other is for books, publishing, and more shopping. Interesting thing about the data there. If the data is incorrect, this pivot table will help you to clean up some of the data. So we can do that later. But the point is that those checks that are in the checking account under AMZ, which is Amazon, are categorized as books, publishing, or shopping. And the checks written to Amazon spelled out are marketing and shopping. Well, I'd like to resolve that difference between the two shopping entries. And what I'm probably going to do later is go to all of the AMZ entries and change the payee to Amazon. So this will all be grouped together. But it's a good way to clean the data. But here's another thing about categories. Sometimes it makes sense to take a look at the expenditures by categories, not necessarily by payee. It's another way to clean up the data. In order to do that, if you want to reverse the sequence, instead of it being in sequence by payees with category subordinate to it, you can take this category field in the rows and just drag it up to above payees. And now the sequence of the pivot table is primarily by category: all accessory payments, all auto payments, all beer payments, interesting, all books, all cash. And you can reduce some of these things if you want, so that you don't have to look necessarily at all of the details of all the places I spent money on food or cash, but you can manipulate these things. So I'm just going to expand these little plus signs back out here so we have all the details. Scroll back up to the top. One more piece of information that I think might be helpful for you to understand in using pivot tables is that it does a nice thing with dates, where if you decide to drag the dates into the columns field here, it will separate but aggregate all the data, all the checks by date. So you can look at January through June. If you want to expand any one of these date fields, you can expand it so that every date is itemized and listed here for each one of the payments, but that may not be particularly relevant now, but you have that option. And if you had multiple years worth of data, you could also separate the date by just year, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2020, all that stuff. But what this shows is the cash sequence or timing of checks that were written for each one of these payees by their categories. So for example, in the Department of Motor Vehicles, I wrote, or somebody wrote, $86 worth of checks in January for the Pennsylvania DMV so that I could re-register my cars. There's no other expenditure for DMV in those 6 months worth of data. For some reason, we got car wash charges done in May and June. I don't know why we didn't just wash the car ourselves, but that's another thing. So this is analytical in that it can show you how much you're spending per month. In the case of ATM withdrawals, here's cash out from January to June. Notice that May is the high point, and May happened to be the month when we took a little vacation. So there was probably a little more cash withdrawals while we were on vacation than other months. And as you can see, that's truly the case. We had $800 in May and $400 and $600 in the other months. So if you look at some of the other things, you can see the history of expenditures. For example, Starbucks, and this is me. I did this, right? So I've got somewhere on the average of $350 a month for Starbucks. I might want to do something about that level of addiction. Oh, it's not addiction, but, you know, whatever it is, but that's whatever it is, that's what it is. So there are some interesting things that you can do with pivot tables that that you need to start with a collection of data that is consistent and reliable, like the checks that I extracted from my checking account. You need to make sure that the data, the caption or the content of these fields is clear. So sometimes you may have to create a shorter version of a category or a category field itself, short payee category, something like that. And then go through the exercise of building a pivot table so that you can see how it is organized and what it can tell you about your spending patterns and also about the accuracy of your data. I hope this helped. If you're interested in finding out more about what I can train for, or if you have some questions about things, please subscribe to the Technically Retired channel on YouTube. If you have any specific questions, please send me an email to whendoyoustop-looking. I'll repeat that again. whendoyoustop-looking@gmail.com. There's only 2 punctuations, the at and the dot. There's no spaces. whendoyoustop-looking@gmail.com. Hopefully I will see you again on another Technically Retired video in the future. Thank you very much. Bye.